In this video, we start chapter 16. This chapter covers off-balance sheet activities. And as usual, we have few learning objectives in this chapter. So we will first of all understand the different off-balance sheet activities. Those are typically used by financial institutions. We will discuss that how these off-balance sheet activities can lead to the solvency problem for a financial institution. We will see the risk and returns associated with these off-balance sheet activities. And also we will see that how these off-balance sheet activities can be used by financial institutions to reduce their risk. So first of all, off-balance sheet activities, what do we mean by them? An item or an activity is an off-balance sheet asset if, when a contingent event occurs, the item or activity moves into the asset side of the balance sheet. Conversely, an item or an activity is an off-balance sheet liability if, when a contingent event occurs, the item or activity moves into the liability side of the balance sheet. Okay, so currently an off-balance sheet asset or off-balance sheet liability is not reported in the balance sheet, but they are typically reported below the balance sheet or in the footnote. However, in the event of occurring a contingent event, an off-balance sheet asset or an off-balance sheet liability can move into the balance sheet. For example, financial institutions sells various performance guarantees, especially guarantees that their customer will not default on their financial and other obligations. Example of such guarantees include letter of credit, standby letter of credit. Should a customer default occur, the financial institution's contingent liability becomes an actual liability and moves into the liability side of the balance sheet. So it means that in the case of a letter of credit, bank guarantees that if a customer defaults, the bank will pay on behalf of the customer. So you understand that when the bank makes the commitment, it's not a liability, it's a contingent liability. And in the event the customer actually defaults, it becomes a liability. Now, you understand that financial institution managers and regulators recognize and measure the risk of off-balance sheet activities and their impact on financial institutions' values. With some off-balance sheet exposure is related to interest rate risk, credit risk, other risk, and these items also introduce unit risk that must also be managed by financial institutions. Now, these are the major type of off-balance sheet activities, so we will be discussing them more detail later. First of all, like loan commitment, you understand we have learned it earlier that in the case of a loan commitment, bank makes a commitment that bank will lend an amount up to a certain limit and within a certain time. So the borrower will be allowed to borrow any money within the limit and within the time period. So when bank makes a commitment, it's not immediately an asset for the bank because the lending has not been made. However, once the borrower borrows, it becomes an asset for the bank. Letter of credit, as I just indicated in the last slide, that bank guarantees that in the event a customer defaults, bank will make the payment. So it's not a liability when bank makes a commitment, but it becomes a liability when a customer actually defaults. You also know about derivative contract, which is essentially an agreement between two counterparties to deliver a standard quantity of an asset at a predetermined price at a predetermined date in the future. And loans sold, you also know, we discussed it earlier, that sometimes a bank makes a loan to a large borrower and then the pieces of loan is sold to others. And so that also may create an off-balance sheet activity or off-balance sheet claim for the banks. We will be discussing more detail later. These are some examples of large derivative trading losses. Obviously, a derivative is a part of off-balance sheet activity for the banks. Now, as I indicated earlier, that since off-balance sheet items are contingent assets and liabilities and move onto the balance sheet with a probability of less than 1, their valuation is difficult and often highly complex. Because the many of balance sheet items involve option features, the most common methodology has been to apply contingent claims option pricing theory model. For example, one relatively simple way is to estimate the value of an off-balance sheet position in options is by calculating the delta of an option. If you can remember, delta of an option is the change in the value of an option for a small unit change in the price of an underlying security. And then it is multiplied by the notional value of the option position. Okay, so to get the exposure of a financial institution to off-balance sheet activity. Now, you also can see that, as I just indicated previously, that loan commitments and letter of credit can be, off-balance sheet activity. They also have option feature. Okay. For example, the holder of a loan commitment or credit line who decides to borrow or draw on the credit line is exercising an option to borrow. When the buyer of a guarantee defaults, this buyer is exercising a default option. Similarly, when the counterparty to a derivative transaction is unable or unwilling to meet its obligation to pay, that's considered an exercise of a default option. So when we calculate the net worth or equity of a financial institution, we typically follow this formula: assets minus liability equals to equity or net worth. However, due to financial institutions' high exposure to off-balance sheet activities nowadays, we should not calculate equity just by looking at the balance sheet component. We should also include this off-balance sheet items. So this is contingent assets minus contingent liabilities. That's added with the difference to get the equity. And you can see that if this part is positive, that means contingent asset is higher than contingent liability. The net worth will be higher compared to the net worth we get when we ignore this off-balance sheet activities. So as I already indicated that the option valuation model is used to find out the financial institution's exposure to off-balance sheet activity. We can calculate in an approximate sense the current or market value of each off-balance sheet asset and liability and its effect on the financial institution's solvency. Indeed, from both the shareholders and regulators' perspective, large increases in the value of off-balance sheet liabilities can render a financial institution economically insolvent just as effectively as can losses due to mismatched interest rate gaps and default or credit losses that we discussed earlier. For example, during the GFC, global losses on off-balance sheet collateralized debt obligations linked to US mortgage reached approximately 260 billion US dollars. So that's the end of our discussion on off-balance sheet activities. In the next video, we will discuss risk and returns associated with off-balance sheet activities. Thank you.